The heat shimmered off the asphalt like a living thing, distorting the air above the parked cars and making the distant buildings waver as if they were underwater. It was the kind of Atlanta afternoon that made people question their life choices, the kind that drove everyone with sense indoors to worship at the altar of air conditioning. The temperature had climbed past 95 degrees by 2 in the afternoon, and the humidity wrapped around everything like a wet blanket, making each breath feel like drinking warm soup. Lieutenant Sarah Collins adjusted her sunglasses and glanced at the rearview mirror, checking on her partner in the back seat. K-9 Max sat alert, despite the heat, his tongue lolling slightly as he panted, but his dark eyes remained sharp and watchful. The Belgian Malinois had seen 7 summers now, and he knew how to pace himself in weather like this. The patrol car's air conditioning worked overtime, creating a bubble of relative comfort as they cruised through the industrial district on the south side of the city. Sarah reached back and scratched behind Max's ear. He leaned into her touch briefly before returning his attention to the window, watching the warehouses and small businesses roll past. This was supposed to be a routine patrol, a lazy summer afternoon, checking on the businesses that lined these streets, making their presence known to discourage any opportunistic crime. The heat tended to bring out the worst in people. Frayed tempers leading to domestic disputes, desperate souls looking for easy scores. They passed a metal fabrication plant, its enormous doors thrown open to catch any hint of breeze. Workers in sweat-stained shirts moved slowly inside, the clang of machinery echoing out into the street. Next came a wholesale plumbing supply warehouse, then a fenced lot full of construction equipment baking in the sun. This was working-class Atlanta, far from the gleaming towers downtown, a neighborhood of honest labor and tight margins. The radio crackled with routine traffic, other units checking in, dispatch sending cars to various calls across the city, nothing urgent, nothing that required their immediate attention. Sarah let the chatter wash over her, half listening for anything that might concern her sector, while she kept her eyes moving, scanning the streets, the alleys, the faces of the few pedestrians brave enough to venture out in this heat. Max shifted in the back seat, and Sarah caught the movement in her peripheral vision. She knew every nuance of her partner's body language, every slight change in posture that might signal something worth investigating. Right now, he was just adjusting his position, seeking a cooler spot on the seat. But she kept watching anyway, because Max had taught her that alertness was never wasted. They turned onto Kellner Street, a stretch of road lined with auto-related businesses. There was a tire shop on the corner, its lot full of used tires stacked in towers that looked ready to topple. Beyond that, a parts store with faded signs in the windows advertising deals on brake pads and oil filters. And halfway down the block, set back from the street behind a cracked concrete lot, sat Moreno's Auto Repair. Sarah had driven past this place dozens of times over the years. It was a fixture of the neighborhood, one of those businesses that seemed to have existed forever, the kind of place where people brought their cars when they needed honest work done at fair prices. The building itself was nothing special, just a cinder-block structure with 3 bay doors, all of them open now to let in whatever air movement the afternoon might offer. A hand-painted sign above the doors announced the business name in faded red letters, and underneath, the promise of quality service since 1987. She was about to drive on when Max made a sound. It was subtle, just a slight change in his breathing pattern, but Sarah had learned to pay attention to these things. She glanced back and saw that his posture had shifted. He was no longer simply watching the world go by. His head was turned toward Moreno's Auto Repair, his ears pricked forward, his nostrils flaring as he sampled the air coming through the car's vents. Sarah slowed the patrol car, watching her partner carefully. Max's body had gone rigid with attention, his muscles tensing beneath his dark coat. This was different from casual interest. This was the posture of a dog who had caught something significant, something that triggered his training. She pulled the car to the side of the road, about 50 yards past the repair shop, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by Max's intensified panting and the tick of the cooling engine. Sarah turned in her seat to face her partner directly. Max met her eyes and whined, a soft sound of urgency. His gaze kept darting back toward the repair shop, and his whole body seemed to quiver with the need to investigate. Sarah had seen this behavior before, in training exercises and real operations. Max had detected something, and he wanted her to know it. She radioed dispatch, keeping her voice calm and professional. She was requesting backup to her location, describing it as a K-9 alert during routine patrol. The dispatcher acknowledged and promised to send a unit, though it might take some time given the afternoon's call volume. Sarah confirmed and signed off, then sat for a moment considering her options. Procedure said she should wait for backup before approaching. But Max was getting more agitated by the second, and whatever he had detected might not wait. Evidence could be moved, suspects could flee, opportunities could be lost. She made her decision. She stepped out of the car, and the heat hit her like a physical force, pressing down on her shoulders and stealing the breath from her lungs. Her uniform immediately began to stick to her skin, the bulletproof vest underneath becoming an instrument of torture. She moved to the rear door and opened it, clipping Max's lead to his tactical harness before allowing him to exit. The dog hit the ground with barely contained energy, his nose immediately going to work. He pulled toward the repair shop, not frantically but with purpose, guiding Sarah across the street and toward the cracked concrete lot. She let him lead, trusting his judgment, keeping her other senses alert for any sign of danger. The lot held about a dozen vehicles in various states of repair. A blue sedan sat on blocks, its wheels removed. A pickup truck had its hood up, engine parts spread on a tarp beside it. An old station wagon with wood paneling looked like it had been there for years, weeds growing up around its flat tires. And against the far fence, a row of cars that appeared to be waiting their turn, including a white cargo van with commercial plates and a black SUV with tinted windows. Max ignored all of these, pulling Sarah past the parked vehicles toward the main building. As they approached, she could see inside the open bay doors. A mechanic in oil-stained coveralls was bent over the engine of a sedan, his back to them. Another was underneath a lifted truck, only his legs visible. The sound of an impact wrench echoed from somewhere deeper inside, the sharp staccato bursts punctuating the afternoon heat. A man emerged from a side door, wiping his hands on a rag. He was in his 50s, with silver hair and a weathered face, wearing a button-down shirt with the Moreno's logo embroidered on the pocket. His expression shifted when he saw Sarah and Max approaching, cycling through surprise, concern, and finally settling on careful friendliness. Victor Moreno had been running this shop for nearly 3 decades. Sarah knew him by reputation, a respected businessman who sponsored Little League teams and donated to community fundraisers. He had never been on the wrong side of a police report, never so much as a parking ticket to his name. He was exactly the kind of citizen that made neighborhoods function, the backbone of working-class Atlanta. He approached them now with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He greeted her politely, asking if there was a problem, offering his help if she needed anything. His voice was pleasant, his manner cooperative, everything a citizen should be when approached by law enforcement. But Sarah noticed that his eyes kept flicking to Max, tracking the dog's movements with more attention than casual curiosity would warrant. Max had not stopped working. He was pulling toward the back of the building, his nose close to the ground, following an invisible trail that only he could perceive. Sarah explained that her K-9 partner had alerted on his property, that she needed to conduct a brief check. She kept her tone professional, non-accusatory, giving Moreno every opportunity to cooperate. His smile flickered just for a moment, before resettling into place. Of course, he said, whatever she needed. He had nothing to hide. This was a legitimate business, everything above board. He would be happy to show her around, answer any questions. He gestured expansively at the shop, the picture of a man with a clear conscience. Sarah thanked him and asked him to remain where he was while she followed up on Max's alert. She did not want him ahead of her, potentially contaminating evidence or alerting anyone else in the building. Moreno nodded agreeably, but she saw something shift in his posture, a subtle tension entering his shoulders. Max led her around the side of the building, past stacks of old tires and rusting car parts. The smell back here was a cocktail of motor oil, rubber and hot metal, powerful enough to make Sarah wonder how Max could detect anything through it. But the dog never hesitated, his nose working constantly, his path straight and determined. They came around to the back of the property, where a chain-link fence separated the lot from an empty field of weeds and broken concrete. A storage shed sat against the fence, its door secured with a padlock. Next to it, arranged in a haphazard pile, were more spare parts, old bumpers, a stack of hubcaps, and a collection of tires in various sizes. Max zeroed in on the tires. He moved among them with precision, sniffing each one briefly before moving on, working his way through the pile with methodical efficiency. Sarah watched him, her heart rate increasing as she recognized the pattern. He was close to something. His movements were becoming more focused, more intense. He stopped at a large tire near the bottom of the pile, a heavy-duty truck tire that looked newer than most of the others. He sat beside it and looked up at Sarah, his signal that he had found what he was searching for. His tail wagged slightly, proud of his work, waiting for her acknowledgement and reward. Sarah praised him quietly, giving him the recognition he deserved, while keeping her attention on the tire. It looked ordinary enough, just another piece of rubber waiting to be sold or recycled. But Max had never given her a false positive in all their years together. Whatever was in that tire, it was worth investigating. She called out to Moreno, asking him to join her. He came around the corner a moment later, his expression carefully neutral. She pointed to the tire and asked him about it, where it came from, who it belonged to. His answers were smooth but vague. He got tires from all over, he said. Customers, suppliers, sometimes just people looking to get rid of their old rubber. He could not possibly track every single one. Sarah nodded, appearing to accept his explanation. Then she told him she needed to examine the tire more closely, that Max's alert gave her probable cause to conduct a search. Moreno's mask slipped again, just briefly, a flash of something dark crossing his features before he regained control. He said he would need to call his lawyer, that he knew his rights, that she could not just search his property without a warrant. She explained that a K-9 alert provided the legal basis for a search, that she did not need a warrant under these circumstances. She kept her voice calm, reasonable, but firm. She was not asking for permission. She was informing him of what was about to happen. Moreno's friendly demeanor evaporated, his jaw tightened, and his hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, Sarah thought he might try to stop her physically, and she shifted her weight, ready to respond. But then he seemed to remember where he was, who he was dealing with. He stepped back, his expression settling into cold resignation, and told her to do what she had to do. Sarah radioed dispatch again, requesting that backup expedite to her location. She was about to open a potentially significant case, and she needed witnesses, needed documentation, needed people she could trust at her back. The dispatcher confirmed that a unit was en route, estimated arrival 5 minutes. While she waited, she kept Max close and maintained visual contact with Moreno. The mechanic from inside the bay had emerged, a young man with a confused expression, asking his boss what was going on. Moreno told him to stay out of it, to go back to work. The young man hesitated, then retreated into the shop, throwing nervous glances over his shoulder. The backup unit arrived, lights but no siren, pulling into the lot with reassuring speed. Two officers emerged, a veteran named Patterson and a younger officer Sarah did not know well, probably new to the precinct. She briefed them quickly on the situation, then assigned Patterson to keep an eye on Moreno, while she and the other officer examined the tire. It took some effort to extract the tire from the pile without disturbing potential evidence. They photographed everything first, documenting the location and position of each item. Then, carefully, they lifted the heavy rubber clear and laid it flat on the concrete. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it, but when Sarah ran her fingers along the inner rim, she felt something that did not belong. A seam, almost invisible where the rubber had been cut and resealed. She called for a knife, and the young officer produced a utility blade from his belt. She cut along the seam, peeling back the rubber to reveal a hollow space carved into the tire's interior, and inside that space, wrapped in plastic and sealed with tape, was a package about the size of a thick phone book. Sarah extracted it carefully, preserving what fingerprints might remain. She laid it on the ground and, with gloved hands, cut away the plastic wrapping. Inside were documents, dozens of them. Passports, driver's licenses, social security cards, birth certificates, all of them appearing genuine at first glance, complete with official seals and holograms. But all of them were blank where the names and photographs should be, waiting to be filled in with whatever identity the purchaser required. Patterson let out a low whistle as he watched her spread the documents across the concrete. This was not small-time forgery. This was professional-grade work, the kind that took skill and equipment and a network to produce. This was the raw material for identity theft on an industrial scale, for smuggling, for fraud, for enabling criminals to disappear and reappear as someone new. Sarah looked up at Moreno, who had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. He was staring at the documents with an expression that mixed fear and calculation, the look of a man running scenarios in his head, trying to figure out how he might salvage this situation. She read him his rights in a clear, steady voice, informing him that he was being detained pending investigation. He started talking before she finished. It was not his, he said. He did not know anything about it. Someone must have planted it, trying to frame him. He was an honest businessman. Everyone knew that. He had never done anything illegal in his life. His voice rose with each denial, panic creeping in around the edges of his forced calm. Sarah let him talk, while Patterson cuffed him. Sometimes suspects gave up useful information when they were rattled, and she wanted to capture every word. But Moreno caught himself before he said anything too damaging, clamping his mouth shut and demanding his lawyer again. More units were arriving now, word spreading through the radio that something significant had been found. A crime scene team was dispatched to process the evidence. Detectives were notified and began making their way to the scene. Within an hour, Moreno's auto repair had transformed from a sleepy neighborhood business into a hive of law enforcement activity. Sarah walked Max back to her patrol car, giving him water and praise, letting him rest in the air-conditioned interior while she coordinated with the arriving personnel. The dog had done exceptional work today, and she wanted him to know it. He drank deeply from the bowl she offered, then settled onto his seat with a contented sigh, his job complete for the moment. The investigation spread outward from that single tire like ripples in a pond. The crime scene team found more hidden compartments throughout the shop, secreted in hollowed-out car parts, inside the walls of the storage shed, even in a false bottom, beneath the floor of one of the service bays. The total haul was staggering. Hundreds of blank documents, printing equipment, embossing machines, hologram stamps, everything needed to produce convincing forgeries. But the documents themselves were just the beginning. Along with the forgery materials, investigators found records, ledgers listing transactions, client codes, delivery dates, payment amounts, a laptop computer with encrypted files that the digital forensics team would spend days cracking. And in Moreno's office, hidden behind a false panel in his filing cabinet, a collection of photographs and handwritten notes that painted a disturbing picture of the operation's reach. Sarah studied the evidence as it was catalogued, trying to piece together the scope of what they had uncovered. This was not just a local operation. The client codes in the ledgers suggested customers across the southeastern United States, possibly beyond. The quality of the forgeries indicated professional training, likely connections to larger criminal networks. And the volume of material suggested that Moreno's shop had been churning out false identities for years, maybe decades. She thought about all the time she had driven past this building, all the time she had waved to Moreno as he stood in his doorway, never suspecting what lay behind his friendly smile. It was a reminder that surfaces could deceive, that the most ordinary-looking people could be hiding extraordinary secrets. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows lengthened, detectives began arriving to take over the investigation. Sarah briefed them on what she had found, walking them through the sequence of events from Max's initial alert to the discovery of the hidden compartments. They listened intently, asking questions, taking notes, already beginning to construct the framework of what would become a major case. One of the detectives, a sharp-eyed woman named Rodriguez, asked Sarah about Max's behavior, wanting to understand exactly what had triggered his alert. Sarah explained that her partner was trained to detect a variety of substances and materials, including the chemicals used in printing and document production. The inks, the paper treatments, the adhesives used in forgery work all had distinctive scent signatures that a trained dog could identify. Rodriguez nodded, making notes. She mentioned that they had been hearing rumors about a document mill operating somewhere in the metro area, but they had never been able to pin down its location. Every lead had gone cold. Every informant had gone silent. Whoever was running this operation had been extremely careful, covering their tracks with professional precision, until today, when a K-9 on routine patrol had cracked the case wide open. Sarah felt a flush of pride, not for herself, but for Max. The dog had done what months of traditional investigation had failed to accomplish. His nose had cut through all the camouflage and misdirection, leading them straight to the heart of the operation. It was a reminder of why K-9 units were so valuable, why the bond between handler and dog was worth cultivating. The sun was setting by the time Sarah finally cleared the scene. The sky above Atlanta had turned a deep orange, the heat finally beginning to break as evening approached. She loaded Max into the patrol car and pulled out of the lot, leaving the continuing investigation in the capable hands of the detective team. As she drove through the twilight streets, her mind kept working the case. Moreno was clearly a key player, but he was not the top of the food chain. Someone had trained him, supplied him, connected him with customers. Someone was running a network, and Moreno's shop was just one node in a larger web. The question was how far that web stretched and who sat at its center. She stopped at a drive-thru and grabbed a burger, eating it one-handed while Max dozed in the back seat. The day's excitement had worn him out, and he was making small sounds in his sleep, his paws twitching as he chased something through his dreams. Sarah smiled and let him rest. He had earned it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez. The detective had already begun working the ledgers, cross-referencing the client codes with known criminal associates. One name kept appearing, a middleman named Terry Huang, who had ties to several organized crime groups. Huang had been on law enforcement's radar for years, but they had never been able to build a case against him. Maybe now they could. Sarah forwarded the information to her lieutenant, adding her own observations and recommendations. This was going to be a multi-agency investigation, probably involving federal partners, given the scope of the forgery operation. She wanted to make sure that the K-9 unit stayed involved, that Max's contribution was not forgotten as the case grew larger. She drove home through the darkening city, past the neighborhoods she had sworn to protect, the people she had dedicated her life to serving. Most of them were just going about their evenings, having dinner with their families, watching television, living their ordinary lives. They would never know about the criminal operation that had been functioning in their midst, producing the false identities that enabled all manner of crimes. They would never know about the dog who had sniffed it out, and that was fine. Sarah did not do this job for recognition. She did it because it needed to be done, because someone had to stand between the predators and the innocent. Max did it because it was in his nature, because he was bred and trained to hunt, and because he loved working with his partner. Together, they made a difference. That was enough. The next morning came too soon, the alarm pulling Sarah from a dreamless sleep before the sun had fully risen. She went through her routine on autopilot, shower and coffee and uniform, her mind already racing ahead to the day's challenges. Max was waiting by the door when she came downstairs, his tail wagging, ready for whatever adventure awaited. They drove to the precinct through the early morning streets, the city still quiet, only a few joggers and delivery trucks stirring in the cool air before the heat returned. Sarah parked and walked Max to the K-9 facility, where she checked his equipment and ran through some basic training exercises to keep his skills sharp. He performed flawlessly as always, his focus and drive unwavering. Rodriguez called mid-morning with news. They had executed search warrants on 3 more locations connected to Moreno's operation, finding additional evidence at each one. The case was expanding rapidly, drawing in resources from multiple departments. And they had identified several of the customers in the ledgers, individuals who had purchased false documents for a variety of purposes. Some were relatively minor cases, people looking to establish new identities after fleeing bad relationships or dodging debts. Troubling, but not catastrophic. But others were more serious, convicted criminals who had used false documents to evade supervision. Fraud artists who had assumed new identities to run scams, and most disturbing, several individuals whose real identities remained unknown, who had purchased documents and then vanished into the fabric of society, their purposes and destinations unclear. Sarah asked about Moreno himself, whether he was cooperating. Rodriguez said he had lawyered up immediately, refusing to answer any questions. His attorney was pushing for bail, arguing that his client was a pillar of the community with no prior record, no flight risk. The prosecutors were pushing back hard, citing the scope of the operation and the potential for witness tampering. The judge would rule later that day. Sarah hoped they could keep Moreno locked up, at least until they could flip him or build a case strong enough to stand without his testimony. Suspects had a way of changing their minds once they spent a few nights in jail, realized the full weight of what they were facing. Maybe Moreno would become more talkative when he understood that his comfortable life was over. Her lieutenant called her in for a briefing, wanting to understand the full sequence of events and assess the K-9 unit's role going forward. Sarah walked him through everything, from Max's initial alert to the discovery of the hidden compartments. She emphasized her partner's exceptional performance, the way he had remained focused despite the heat, the distracting smells of the auto shop, all the factors that might have thrown off a lesser dog. The lieutenant was impressed, making notes about commendations and training opportunities. He asked Sarah if she thought Max could be useful in the continuing investigation, whether the dog might be able to identify other locations connected to the forgery network. She said absolutely, that Max's nose was the most valuable tool they had, that he could detect the scent signatures of the documents and materials, even in trace amounts. They discussed logistics, coordinating with the detective unit, ensuring that the K-9 team was available when needed. The lieutenant promised to make it a priority, recognizing the value that Max brought to the investigation. Sarah left the meeting feeling optimistic. The case was moving forward, and her partnership with Max was at the center of it. The day unfolded in a blur of activity. More search warrants, more evidence, more connections being drawn between seemingly unrelated people and places. The detective team was working around the clock, pulling threads and following leads. Sarah and Max were called to assist at 2 more locations, the dog's nose confirming the presence of forgery materials that human investigators might have missed. At one location, a storage unit in a strip mall on the north side of the city, Max alerted on a locked container that the facility manager claimed had been abandoned. When they cut the lock and opened the doors, they found boxes of blank document stock, reams of specialized paper that matched what they had seized at Moreno's shop. The paper alone was worth tens of thousands of dollars, custom manufactured to match official government specifications. At another location, a modest house in a quiet residential neighborhood, Max led them to a converted garage that contained printing equipment and a sophisticated computer setup. The homeowner, a nervous man in his 30s, initially claimed that he was a legitimate graphic designer, that the equipment was for his business, but his story fell apart under questioning, and he eventually admitted to being Moreno's primary printing specialist, producing the physical documents from the blank stock. His name was Alan Cheswick, and unlike Moreno, he was willing to talk. He gave up details about the operation in exchange for consideration in his sentencing, painting a picture of a criminal enterprise that had operated successfully for over a decade. Moreno had recruited him years ago, recognizing his technical skills and offering him money he could not refuse. Cheswick had convinced himself that he was not really hurting anyone, just making paper for people who needed second chances. But when the detectives showed him the case files on some of their identified customers, when they described the crimes that had been committed using documents he had created, Cheswick's justifications crumbled. He broke down in the interview room, weeping about his own stupidity, his own greed, all the harm he had enabled without ever seeing the consequences. It was pathetic, but it was also useful. His testimony would be valuable in building the larger case. Sarah watched the interview through the one-way glass, Max lying at her feet. The dog was dozing after another long day, his energy reserves depleted by hours of work. But his ears still twitched at sounds from the interview room, still alert even in rest. She reached down and stroked his head, grateful for his presence, his partnership, his unwavering loyalty. Rodriguez came out of the interview room looking tired but satisfied. Cheswick was giving them everything, she said, names and dates and locations that would keep the investigation running for months. And he had confirmed what they suspected about Terry Huang, identifying him as the middleman who connected Moreno's operation with the broader criminal network. Huang was the next target. But Huang would be harder to catch. He was careful, paranoid, never staying in one place for long. He used burner phones and encrypted communications, met contacts only in crowded public spaces where surveillance was difficult. He had been doing this for years, staying one step ahead of law enforcement through a combination of tradecraft and luck. They would need to be smart about approaching him. Sarah asked how she could help. Rodriguez considered for a moment, then suggested that the K-9 unit might be useful in conducting a surveillance operation. If they could identify locations that Huang frequented, Max could potentially detect traces of document materials, confirming connections without requiring a physical search that might tip off the target. It was an unconventional use of K-9 capabilities, but Sarah was willing to try. She worked with the detective team to identify potential locations, businesses, and residences associated with Huang or his known contacts. They developed a plan to conduct drive-by reconnaissance, using Max's nose to screen for the chemical signatures of the forgery operation. Over the next 3 days, Sarah and Max crisscrossed the city, visiting dozens of locations on the detectives' list. Most returned negative results, no reaction from Max beyond casual interest in the normal smells of urban life. But at 4 locations, The dog alerted with varying degrees of intensity, suggesting trace evidence of the materials they were seeking. One was a print shop in an industrial park, legitimate on the surface but owned by a company that had tangential connections to Huang. Another was a private mailbox store that offered anonymous receiving services, the kind of place where criminals might pick up documents without leaving a paper trail. The third was a restaurant known to be popular with certain criminal elements, a place where deals might be negotiated over dim sum and tea. And the fourth was an apartment complex near the airport, unremarkable except for the fact that one of the units was leased to a name that appeared in Chesik's records. The detective team used this information to focus their investigation, obtaining warrants where justified, conducting surveillance where they needed more evidence. Sarah's role shifted from active searcher to supporting investigator, providing intelligence that helped guide the larger effort. It was less exciting than the initial discovery at Moreno's shop, but no less important. Max seemed to understand the change in their duties, adapting his behavior to match. He was more patient during the long surveillance sessions, more alert during the brief moments of activity. His nose remained sharp, his judgment sound, his partnership with Sarah as strong as ever. Together, they were making a difference, even if the work was less dramatic than the movies made it seem. A week after the initial discovery, the case broke wide open. Detectives executed simultaneous raids on multiple locations, identified through the investigation, arresting 17 individuals connected to the forgery network. Huang was among them, caught at the restaurant during a meeting with potential clients. He went down fighting, literally, throwing punches at the arresting officers before being subdued and cuffed. The news media picked up the story, running breathless coverage of the major bust and the scope of the criminal operation. Sarah watched the reports from the precinct break room, uncomfortable with the attention, even though she knew it was not focused on her. The department's public affairs office was handling all media inquiries, presenting a unified narrative that emphasized teamwork and professional investigation. No mention was made of the K-9 unit that had started it all. Sarah was fine with that. Max did not need publicity, did not crave recognition. He was happy with belly rubs and treats, with the satisfaction of a job well done. And Sarah preferred to work in the background, letting the detectives take the spotlight while she prepared for the next case. But her lieutenant made sure that the contribution was recognized internally. At the weekly briefing, he singled out Sarah and Max for exceptional performance, describing how the routine patrol had uncovered a criminal enterprise that had evaded detection for over a decade. The room applauded, colleagues offering congratulations and handshakes. Max wagged his tail at the attention, enjoying the positive energy without understanding its source. Life returned to something like normal in the days that followed. Sarah and Max resumed their regular patrol duties, covering their sector, responding to calls, maintaining the visible presence that deterred crime and reassured citizens. The forgery case continued to develop in the background, prosecutors building their charges while defense attorneys maneuvered for advantage, but that was out of Sarah's hands now. Still, the case had reminded her of something important. It had reminded her that crime did not always look the way people expected, that ordinary businesses could hide extraordinary evil, that the line between legitimate and criminal was often thinner than it appeared. And it had reminded her of the value of partnerships, both human and canine, of working together toward goals that neither could achieve alone. She thought about Moreno, sitting in jail awaiting trial, his reputation destroyed, his future measured in prison years. He had built something impressive in a twisted way, a criminal enterprise that had functioned smoothly for so long that he must have believed it would last forever. But all it had taken was one patrol on a hot summer afternoon, one dog following his nose, one alert that set everything in motion. She thought about the victims too, the people whose identities had been stolen or forged, the businesses defrauded by criminals using false documents, the individuals who had fled one kind of trouble only to find themselves entangled in another. The forgery operation had caused harm that would take years to fully quantify, ripples of damage spreading through countless lives. At least now it had been stopped. 3 weeks after the initial arrest, Sarah received a call from Rodriguez. The detective sounded energized, excited in a way that suggested a new development. She asked Sarah to come to the precinct, to bring Max, to be prepared for another assignment. When she arrived, Rodriguez was waiting with a team of investigators gathered around a conference table covered in documents and photographs. They had been following the money, the detective explained, tracing financial flows connected to the forgery operation. And they had found something unexpected. The payments for Moreno's documents did not just go to criminal organizations. A significant portion of the revenue had been flowing to a charitable foundation, a non-profit that provided services to immigrant communities. On the surface, it looked like money laundering, cleaning dirty cash through legitimate-seeming donations. But the investigators suspected something more complex. The foundation was called the New Horizons Assistance Network, and it was run by a woman named Margaret Chen. Chen was a respected figure in the advocacy community, known for her work helping immigrants navigate complex legal systems, fighting against exploitation and discrimination. She had been honored by the mayor's office, featured in newspaper profiles, invited to speak at conferences and symposiums. But the financial connections were undeniable. Money from the forgery operation had been flowing to her foundation for years, hundreds of thousands of dollars, disguised as anonymous donations. Either Chen knew where the money came from and was complicit in the crime, or she was an unwitting participant being used as a front for money laundering. Either way, they needed to investigate. This was where Sarah and Max came in. The investigators wanted to search the foundation's offices, but they needed probable cause for a warrant. If Max could alert on the premises, indicating the presence of forgery materials or connected substances, it would give them the justification they needed to move forward. Sarah studied the briefing materials, committing key details to memory. The foundation's offices were located in a converted house in a residential neighborhood, presenting a friendly face to the communities it served. Chen worked there most days, along with a small staff of employees and volunteers. The operation would need to be handled delicately, given the foundation's public profile and the potential for backlash if they were wrong. They planned the approach for the following morning. Sarah would bring Max to the neighborhood on the pretext of a community outreach event, a chance for local residents to meet a police K-9 and ask questions about public safety. While conducting this event, she would maneuver close enough to the foundation's building for Max to conduct a preliminary screening. If he alerted, they would have their probable cause. The morning of the operation was cool and clear, autumn beginning to assert itself over the lingering summer heat. Sarah, dressed in a community engagement uniform, less intimidating than her regular patrol gear, designed to put civilians at ease. Max wore a special vest that identified him as a friendly K-9, approachable but still professional. The outreach event was set up in a small park about a block from the foundation's offices. Tables were arranged with informational materials, and other officers mingled with the residents who stopped by. It was a genuine community event, not just cover for the investigation, and Sarah found herself enjoying the interactions with curious children and grateful parents. But she kept her attention partly focused on the real mission. As the morning progressed, she gradually moved Max toward the edge of the park, the direction that brought them closer to the foundation's building. The dog seemed to pick up on her intent, his posture shifting from relaxed friendliness to focused alertness. They walked along the sidewalk that ran past the foundation's property, Max sniffing the air with increasing intensity. Sarah watched his body language carefully, looking for the signs that would indicate an alert. He was interested, definitely, his nose working overtime. But he had not given the definitive signal that she was waiting for. She walked the length of the property, then doubled back, giving Max multiple passes at different angles. Each time, he showed interest, without committing to an alert. It was frustrating, ambiguous, not the clear evidence she had hoped for. Maybe the foundation was clean. Maybe there was nothing here to find. She was about to call off the screening when Max suddenly changed direction, pulling toward a driveway that led behind the building. His intensity spiked, his whole body leaning into the lead, the unmistakable posture of a dog who had found what he was looking for. Sarah let him lead her up the driveway, past a parked car and a row of recycling bins. Behind the building was a small parking lot with spaces for staff and visitors. A door led from the lot into the back of the building, and beside the door was a collection of cardboard boxes waiting for recycling pickup. Max went straight to the boxes. He sniffed along their surfaces, then sat down and looked up at Sarah with calm certainty. This was his alert, clear and definitive. There was something here. Sarah radioed the surveillance team positioned nearby, informing them of the positive alert. Within minutes, they had contacted the judge who was standing by for this eventuality, obtaining a warrant based on Max's indication. The investigation was moving forward. The next hour was organized chaos. Officers secured the perimeter of the property while detectives moved to execute the warrant. Staff members and clients emerged from the building, confused and frightened, demanding to know what was happening. Margaret Chen came to the front door, her expression cycling through shock, anger, and carefully managed composure. Sarah and Max joined the search team inside the building. The Foundation's offices were modest but professional, cubicles and conference rooms arranged in what had once been a residential living space. Motivational posters decorated the walls, proclaiming messages about hope and opportunity. It all looked legitimate, the kind of non-profit that did important work in underserved communities. But Max led them to a storage closet in the back of the building, a space filled with office supplies and old files. He alerted on a box on the top shelf, his signal clear and certain. When investigators opened the box, they found document materials similar to what they had seized at Moreno's shop. Blank stock, security paper, materials for producing forgeries. The evidence did not stop there. A thorough search of the premises uncovered records showing the connection between the Foundation and the forgery operation. Chen had known exactly where her donations were coming from. More than that, she had been an active participant, using the Foundation as a distribution point for completed documents, getting them into the hands of clients who had paid Moreno for new identities. Her motivation was complicated, idealistic in a twisted way. Many of her clients were undocumented immigrants, desperate for papers that would let them work, drive, and live without fear. Chen had convinced herself that she was helping them, providing a service that the legitimate system denied. She did not see herself as a criminal, but as a crusader working outside unjust laws. But her operation had not limited itself to helping sympathetic cases. The money had corrupted everything, turning a charitable mission into a criminal enterprise. Documents produced through her network had ended up in the hands of people with far less noble intentions. Criminals escaping justice, fraudsters establishing false identities, individuals whose purposes were never examined too closely, as long as the cash kept flowing. Chen was arrested and charged alongside the others. The Foundation was shut down, its clients left scrambling to find alternative services. It was a necessary outcome, but Sarah could not help feeling the weight of it, the collateral damage that came with enforcing the law. Some of those clients had been vulnerable people with nowhere else to turn. Now they had even fewer options. The forgery case eventually went to trial, a sprawling proceeding that took months to unfold. Sarah was called as a witness, testifying about Max's alert at the auto shop and the subsequent discoveries. She kept her statements factual and professional, letting the evidence speak for itself. Moreno was convicted on multiple counts, sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Huang got 20 years, his role as middleman earning him additional charges and harsher treatment. Chen received 8 years, her genuine charitable work earning her some consideration from the judge, though not enough to avoid serious consequences. The smaller players received varying sentences based on their levels of involvement. Chezik, who had cooperated fully, got a reduced sentence that would see him out in 5 years with good behavior. Others who had remained silent or fought the charges fared worse. In the end, the investigation dismantled a criminal network that had operated for over a decade, producing thousands of false documents that had enabled fraud, evasion, and exploitation across the southeastern United States. It was a significant achievement, the kind of case that defined careers and changed institutional priorities. And it had all started with a dog's nose on a hot summer afternoon. Sarah returned to her regular duties with a sense of accomplishment and renewed purpose. Max seemed unchanged by their moment in the spotlight, still the same focused, loyal partner he had always been. They patrolled their sector, responded to calls, maintained the presence that kept communities safe. But sometimes, driving past auto shops and industrial buildings, Sarah would think about what might be hidden behind ordinary facades. She would watch Max in her rearview mirror, alert to every shift in his posture, every twitch of his nose. And she would remember that justice often started with small moments, routine patrols, unremarkable afternoons that turned extraordinary without warning. The city sprawled around them, vast and complex, full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Sarah did not know what the next case would bring, what hidden truth Max's nose would reveal. But she knew they would face it together, partners in every sense of the word, working to protect the people who depended on them. The sun was setting again. Another day ending, another patrol winding down. Sarah reached back and scratched behind Max's ear, feeling his warm presence, his steady breathing, his unwavering trust. He leaned into her touch, content in the moment, ready for whatever came next. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to make a difference. For now, though, they drove through the golden light of evening, two partners in the endless work of keeping the peace. The cityscape painted itself in shades of amber and rose as they headed back to the precinct. Max watched the passing streets with calm attention, his day's work complete, but his vigilance never truly off. Sarah guided the patrol car through familiar roads, nodding to pedestrians who recognized the K-9 unit, checking the corners and alleys from habit, even though she was technically off-duty. The radio chattered with routine traffic, other units signing off as the shift changed, overnight patrols checking in as they took over. Sarah added her voice to the chorus, reporting that K-9 Unit 7 was returning to base, no incidents to report. The dispatcher acknowledged with practiced efficiency another small transaction in the endless flow of police communication. At the precinct, she went through the end-of-shift rituals that had become second nature over years of service. Max was checked by the K-9 handler on duty, his equipment inspected and stored, his needs attended to before anything else. Sarah filed her reports, documenting the day's activities with the thoroughness that investigations demanded. She stopped by her lieutenant's office to brief him on the latest developments in the forgery case, the trial updates and conviction news that had been trickling in. He listened with satisfaction, praising her work again, reminding her that the department valued what she and Max brought to the team. It was gratifying to hear, even if she did not need the validation. Walking to her car in the parking lot, Max at her side, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here, not the specific steps of her career, which she kept compartmentalized according to protocol, but the broader arc of purpose that gave meaning to her daily efforts. She had chosen this life because she believed in justice, in protection, in standing between the vulnerable and those who would harm them. Max had not chosen anything. He had been born with certain instincts, then shaped by training into the remarkable partner he had become. But somewhere in that process, something had emerged that went beyond programming. He trusted Sarah completely, worked with her seamlessly, seemed to share her commitment to their mission even though he could not articulate it. Their partnership was a kind of miracle, she thought. Two different species, with different capabilities and perspectives, united in common cause. Max could smell what Sarah could never perceive, detect threats that human senses would miss. Sarah could understand contexts that Max could not grasp, make decisions that required human judgment. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. She loaded Max into her personal vehicle, different from the patrol car, but equally familiar to him. He settled into the back seat with a contented sigh, recognizing the transition from work mode to home mode. His tail wagged lazily as Sarah pulled out of the lot, heading toward the house they shared, the refuge from duty where they could simply be companions rather than partners. The drive home took them through neighborhoods that shifted from commercial to residential, from dense urban blocks to quieter streets with trees and lawns. Sarah watched the changes without really seeing them, her thoughts still processing the day, the case, the larger questions of justice and consequence. The forgery network had been dismantled, its key players facing prison time, its operations scattered and destroyed. That was unambiguously good. Criminals who had enabled fraud and evasion and identity theft were being held accountable. The system had worked, more or less, channeling evidence through proper procedures to produce fair outcomes. But Sarah could not quite shake her thoughts about Margaret Chen, the advocate who had crossed the line from helping people to enabling crimes. Her intentions had been good, at least initially. She had seen vulnerable immigrants trapped by systems that seemed designed to exclude them, and she had decided to help however she could. The slide into criminality had been gradual, each compromise making the next one easier, until she was deeply embedded in an operation that hurt as many people as it helped. It was a reminder that good intentions were not enough, that breaking rules, even for sympathetic reasons, opened doors that were hard to close, that justice required structure and accountability, even when those structures seemed unjust to those caught in their constraints. Sarah did not have easy answers to these questions. She was a law enforcement officer, committed to upholding the laws as written, not as she might wish them to be. But she could recognize complexity, could acknowledge that the world was not simple, could carry out her duties with compassion, even when compassion conflicted with code. Max did not worry about such things. His world was simpler, defined by sense and signals, by the approval of his handler and the satisfaction of a job well done. Sarah envied him sometimes, envied the clarity of purpose that seemed to come naturally to him, but she also knew that her own complexity was necessary. Someone had to grapple with the hard questions, to navigate the grey areas that pure instinct could not address. That was part of her role, just as much as patrolling streets and processing evidence. She was the conscience of the partnership, the one who had to make decisions that mattered. They pulled into the driveway of her modest house as the last light faded from the sky. Max perked up at the familiar surroundings, eager to be released into the yard where he could run and explore without the constraints of duty. Sarah obliged him, opening the gate to the fenced backyard, watching as he bounded into the grass with unleashed joy. She stood on the porch for a moment, watching him play, feeling the satisfaction of another day completed. Another small contribution to the endless work of keeping the peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But right now, in this quiet moment, she could simply appreciate what they had accomplished together. Max returned to her side, panting happily, ready for dinner and rest. She scratched behind his ears, feeling his warmth, his presence, his unspoken loyalty. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, points of light emerging from the vast darkness. Sarah looked up at them for a moment, reminded of her own smallness in the grand scheme of things, but also of the importance of doing what she could with what she had. She went inside, Max following close behind, and closed the door on another day in Atlanta. The city continued its endless pulse beyond her walls, crime and commerce and ordinary life mixing in patterns too complex to fully understand. But within her small sphere of influence, she had made a difference. That was enough. That had to be enough. The weeks that followed settled into familiar routines, the extraordinary fading back into the ordinary flow of police work. Sarah and Max patrolled their sector, responded to calls, maintained the presence that communities depended on. The forgery case receded into background noise, occasional updates from the prosecution team, media coverage of sentencing hearings, the gradual closure of open files. But the experience had changed something in Sarah, sharpened her awareness of how easily crime could hide in plain sight. She found herself looking at familiar businesses with new eyes, wondering what secrets might lurk behind routine facades. Max seemed to sense her heightened alertness, matching her attention with his own. Their partnership synchronized in ways that words could not capture. One afternoon, on patrol through a different sector covering for a unit on medical leave, they passed a storage facility that triggered Max's interest. Nothing as dramatic as the auto shop, just a slight change in his posture, a momentary focus that Sarah might have missed if she had not been watching for it. She filed the observation away, mentioned it in her report, let the system process the information through proper channels. Maybe it would lead somewhere, maybe it would not. That was not her decision to make. Her job was to gather evidence, to report what she observed, to trust her partner's nose, and let the investigators follow up. Months later, that storage facility would be raided based on accumulated evidence from multiple sources, Sarah's report being one small piece of a larger puzzle. A drug distribution operation would be dismantled, mid-level dealers arrested, supply chains disrupted. Sarah would never know for certain how much her observation contributed, and that was fine. Results mattered more than recognition. Max was getting older, she noticed. Still sharp, still capable, but the years were beginning to show in small ways. He recovered more slowly from strenuous days, slept more deeply, moved with slightly less explosive energy than before. 7 years was not old for a Belgian Malinois, but it was not young either. She tried not to think about how many good years they might have left. For now, though, he was still her partner, still the most reliable colleague she had ever worked with. His nose remained as sharp as ever, his judgment as sound, his loyalty as absolute. Whatever time they had together, she would make the most of it. The sun set on Atlanta once again, painting the sky in familiar colors, marking the end of another day in their shared mission. Sarah drove through the golden light, Max alert in the back seat, the city spreading around them in all its complexity and contradiction. Justice was never finished, never complete. There would always be another case, another criminal, another victim needing protection. The work continued regardless of individual triumphs or failures, an endless tide that individual officers could only hope to influence at the margins. But those margins mattered. Every case solved, every criminal caught, every document seized made a difference to someone. The forgery operation would no longer produce false identities. The drug distribution would no longer poison communities. Small victories accumulated into larger changes, incremental progress toward a world that was slightly safer, slightly more just. Sarah and Max were part of that progress, two members of a vast team working toward common goals. Their partnership was just one thread in a larger fabric, but it was a strong thread, tested and proven. They headed home as the stars emerged, ready for rest, ready for tomorrow, ready for whatever challenges the city would bring. Together, always together, in the endless work of making things better. The night settled over Atlanta like a familiar blanket, darkness bringing its own rhythms and dangers, its own calls for service that other units would answer. Sarah's shift was over, but the police work never stopped, a continuous relay of officers passing responsibilities from one pair of hands to another. She pulled into her driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the silence. Max waited patiently in the back, understanding that she needed this brief pause, this transition between the demands of duty and the peace of home. Then she opened her door, released him from the vehicle, and walked toward the house where warmth and rest awaited. Max bounded ahead, tail wagging, all traces of his professional demeanor dissolving into simple K-9 joy. Sarah smiled and followed her partner inside, closing the door on the world outside, ready for the quiet hours that would restore her for another day. Tomorrow, the work would continue, but tonight, she could rest.